Okay, colleagues, hello and welcome back. Now, today I've set myself quite an impossible task of giving an overview of all of the major sophists. I say impossible because, as I hope to be able to show in the next few minutes, that the legacy of these thinkers is incredibly rich and diverse, also quite controversial, and very often misunderstood. So, to be honest, at best, I hope to be able to hit, so to speak, some of the highlights of their philosophies, which, similarly to most of the previous thinkers we have discussed here, survives only in fragments, often retold by unsympathetic or critical sources. So, before I get to the thinkers themselves, and I am planning to cover, let's say, 6 or 7 names. These would be Protagoras, Gorgias, Thrasymachus, Callicles, and Antiphon. These are the main ones. And then I'd like to also say at least a couple words about Critias, the author of the play Sisyphus. And finally, I would like to situate the paradigmatic work of the great ancient Greek historian Thucydides in the sophistic context. Now, again, before we begin, let me digress and say at least a few words by way of the general introduction. So, in present-day speech, words such as sophist, sophism, or the adjective sophistic usually carry a highly negative connotation. To be a sophist is to be disingenuous, to be hypocritical, to lie. In an important sense, this identification, or properly speaking, this misidentification, is by and large due to a successful smear campaign perpetrated first by Plato, it seems, and then later taken up very importantly by the medieval monotheistic traditions, Christian, Jewish, and Muslim, which saw the relativism and the skepticism of the sophistic movement as something sinful, criminal, vicious. Now, in an important sense, I see my mission in this and other courses that I teach to rectify this situation, at least to some extent. I have to confess, I am very often amazed and baffled by the apodictic tone with which so many professors that I have seen dismiss the sophists as shallow and false, and in general teach classes on sophists with the pedagogical strategy that presupposes that, of course, the sophists are wrong, and it is the task of the students to see exactly wherein lies their mistake. And this is honestly quite amazing to me for at least a couple of reasons. One is that I think that the legacy of the sophists is very much alive today in the academia, in the various circles affiliated with the labels of postmodernism, post-positivism, social constructionism, or social constructivism, etc., etc. So, to dismiss the sophists as superficially false, even though their positions are prominently held in contemporary academia, strikes me as deeply myopic. But I think there's a deeper reason why I find the dismissal of the sophistic movement as so problematic. And this reason, I think, is much more respectable from a historical, philosophical standpoint. I think a lot of people would be willing to go so far as to dismiss contemporary postmodernists, postpositivists, and social constructivists as also somehow false and fraudulent, although I myself am deeply sympathetic to these movements and find these characterizations, let's say, naive. But okay, let's suppose one finds Derrida or Richard Rorty distasteful. I personally disagree, but what of it? So the deeper reason I'm alluding to is that I would say that the entire core, the essence of the Western philosophical tradition, starting with thinkers such as Niccolo Machiavelli, René Descartes, and Thomas Hobbes, to name just a few thinkers. So the entire core of the Western philosophical tradition is deeply imbued with the same skeptical and relativist ideas that the ancient sophists were so famous for. So to dismiss the sophists is not just to attack Derrida, it is also to attack Descartes and Hobbes and Nietzsche, and I would also say to attack John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx. And that, I think, is a much more problematic enterprise. So, to try to simplify my point, and maybe to put it differently, it seems to me that so many histories of Western philosophy get it completely backwards, in a sense that, from a broad historical philosophical perspective, it is not Plato or Aristotle, but it is precisely the ancient sophists, and also the ancient skeptics, the Pyrrhonian school, for example. It is the ancient materialists and the ancient hedonists, like Democritus and Epicurus, whom we, in the 21st century, should first and foremost read, with whose legacy we should first and foremost engage. Let me add one additional point. The main department in which I teach right now is the Department of International Relations. And I think international relations students understand this far clearer than students of many other disciplines. If we think of the kinds of debates that go on in the Assembly of the United Nations or in the Security Council, the appeal to universal justice or universal truth appears at times misplaced and naive, and at times appears as insidious and false. And this brings us to the two ideas, which were indeed highly important to the ancient sophists, two related ideas. First, the skeptical admission of the limited nature of human intellect, whether the gods exist or not, whether true justice exists or not. We, human beings, with our limited intelligence, do not have any unproblematic, surefire access to these truths. We should recognize that it is possible to be misguided, that it is possible to be persuaded for the wrong reasons, to accept the wrong views. And in fact, looking at the history of humanity, I think it's very clear that certitude is a horrible guide, is a horrible indication of correctness of one's views. One can find literally a million examples of various intellectual and moral positions that people held in the past with incredible conviction that we right now regard as false or amoral. And if anything, this should teach us to also regard our positions with a grain of salt, to keep an open mind, to be open to the possibility that we may indeed be wrong and that we shall have to reconsider our views. Incidentally, another position which resonates with the ancient sophists is that there are no knockdown arguments in philosophy. In fact, as far as arguments go, there are always two equally convincing arguments on every side of the issue. And at the end of the day, the question of truth or justice ultimately is a question of social consensus, of a consensus that emerges from public discourse and deliberation. So, to repeat, I promise to talk about the two, broadly speaking, sophistic positions that I think are quite evident from the analysis of the functioning of the international political system in the 21st century. The first one, again, is that there is no straightforward, unproblematic access to the truth. There are no knockdown arguments. And the second is that very often the talk of truth with a capital T or justice with a capital J is simply used as a rhetorical device to mask the interests of this or that particular group, this or that particular party. And I think that recognizing these two disconcerting facts, as much as it pains one to contemplate them, and as much as we would wish to live in a different world, but still to recognize these facts, I think, is a moral and a political necessity. Okay. So with these introductions out of the way, let's, metaphorically speaking, travel back to the ancient past, to the city of Athens, first and foremost, and let us look closer at the biggest names in the sophistic movement. Though, of course, as we shall see, the various sophists did, at times, hold not only differing, but sometimes contrary positions. So even though I think there are some broad similarities, we should not really think of them as anything like a unified school. So now I actually want to turn to Protagoras and to consider his views in some detail. Though before I do that, one last preliminary remark. For anyone who wishes to get acquainted with a more sympathetic presentation of the sophists, there are 3 or 4 sources that I could recommend. I'll put the links in the video description, but basically they are George Klosko's Political Theory by Oxford University Press 2012, then David Boucher and Paul Kelly's Political Thinkers, Oxford University Press 2017, then obviously there's the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and finally there's a wonderful volume by Cambridge University Press called Early Greek Political Thought from Homer to the Sophists by Michael Gagarin and Paul Woodruff. Okay, so now to Protagoras. I find Protagoras a deeply fascinating thinker, really deserving of his own separate lecture, but we'll try to do some justice to him, at least in a preliminary way. So, as always, all of our information is highly uncertain, and we must always keep in mind that the later tradition that preserved and relayed the quotations and the stories from Protagoras' life was deeply unsympathetic to the sophistic enterprise. So, according to tradition, Protagoras was born in the city of Abdera in Thrace. There is a slight possibility he may have been in contact with another fascinating philosopher from Abdera, Democritus. Stimulates the imagination, but it's hard to be sure. As many other sophists, Protagoras came to Athens, where his services as a teacher were in demand. There, allegedly, he became friends with Pericles, and later in life even helped to write the constitution for the newly established colony of Thurii, or Thurii, however you want to pronounce that. If we can trust these stories, then we get a picture of a man who is very much at home in the world of politics, who has a first-hand experience of the internal operations of the political processes at the highest level. And indeed it seems that his philosophy is uniquely attentive to the nuances of sophisticated political life. One possible way to enter into the philosophy of Protagoras is to look at his famous dictum that man is the measure of all things, of things that they are, and of things that are not, that they are not. Now, philosophers to this day debate the exact meaning of this statement, but we can begin by assuming that Protagoras here subscribes to a kind of relativism. Now, the extreme forms of relativism would indeed entail that nothing is objectively true, and that nothing objectively exists. However, there are also more moderate interpretations of the relativist position, and to me it seems much more productive to engage with these more moderate forms. So, first of all, I think there's a deep intuition permeating all of ancient Greek philosophy, the intuition that human intellect is radically limited, that we can hypothesize, we can have conjectures, we can construct likely accounts, but the true nature of reality as it exists in and of itself is not accessible to us in an unproblematic fashion. Probably the highest expression of this opinion comes from Socrates, actually, in his Apology, where Socrates proclaims that he knows nothing, and in fact, he conjectures that God Apollo, through his oracle at Delphi, so Apollo is informing mankind of this great discrepancy between the intellectual abilities of gods and men, that whereas gods know things as they are, men are essentially ignorant, and that man is wise, who, like Socrates, understands that at the end of the day, he only knows that he knows nothing. So obviously I'm trying to construct a very sympathetic picture of Protagoras' philosophy, But I think it is, broadly speaking, fair to the original material that has come down to us. So on this reconstruction, what Protagoras is saying is that human reason is limited, and therefore we do not really have an objective, apodictic, surefire, knockdown measure of truth or falsehood of statements. Therefore, we can only resort to dialogue, and therefore, ultimately, our deepest convictions, our most fundamental beliefs, and maybe also our most cherished and most sacred assumptions, can only be based on something like social consensus. Let me note that this is more or less exactly the picture, at least in broad outlines, that we get in contemporary philosophy of science, especially after Thomas Kuhn's book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, published in 1962. Again, this idea that there are no firm foundations underlying our contemporary scientific enterprise. So modern chemistry, evolutionary biology, pharmacology, medicine, gene editing techniques, gravitational observatories, and all the rest of them, that at the end of the day, the radical skepticism of philosophers like René Descartes, or David Hume, or Immanuel Kant, that these sorts of radical skepticism cannot be defeated. And therefore, we are only left with a kind of a Wittgensteinian language game, a deeply practical and essentially social, and ultimately a political enterprise of building consensus or solidarity. I mean, we hope that in the course of this enterprise, we are moving closer to the truth with a capital T, but there's no way to guarantee that. Okay, so that was a bit of a digression, but I hope an instructive digression. Let us go back to Protagoras. So man is the measure of all things. And again, in more extreme ways, this could be taken to imply that each individual person is the judge of what is true or not true. But it seems that Protagoras was more interested in a kind of cultural relativism, in the sense that different cultures have different beliefs. So man is the measure of all things, but he or she measures according to the ruler, so to speak, given to him or her by their culture. And of course, when we talk about these kinds of measures, it seems that Protagoras is much more interested in questions of ethics or politics than in questions of, let's say, metaphysics or physics or medicine, let's say. So what I'm trying to say is that Protagoras seems to be less of a physical or scientific skeptic and more of a moral skeptic. So it may very well be that if you're trying to build a house or even to cure a sick patient, there are more or less objective ways of doing that. However, when you try to decide on your values, this is when the genuine problems arise. So I think a different way of looking at the same problem is the following. You see, animals seem to just behave in an instinctual fashion. Animals don't need to decide. They do not need to deliberate. In fact, they cannot. Among other things, they have no language that is required for conscious thought. But human beings are different. In fact, Protagoras, in the Plato's dialogue bearing his name, tells the following story, a myth, of how the gods distributed all the various skills and abilities to all the various animals. So some animals are quick, some have sharp claws, some can climb trees. But human beings are born, so to speak, without any special talent, an idea which will be developed in later philosophical tradition. This notion that human beings are born, in a certain sense, unfinished, lacking the skills necessary to survive on their own. Rousseau would call this perfectibility, our ability to change, which comes precisely from the fact that we are, so to speak, born immature. We can change because, to speak crudely, our behavior is not 100% pre-programmed by our instincts. And notice also this idea that the gods were distributing the skills and abilities to animals, and then the gods ran out, and they forgot the humans. There is, I think, a certain intimation in the Protagoras' speech that this world is not really our home. And this universe is not necessarily ruled by a providential god or gods who deeply care about us. On the contrary, gods have forsaken us, and we have to take matters into our own hands. We have to take care of ourselves. Gods do not watch over us. So the next thing that happens in the story is that Prometheus steals fire and also the various crafts and gives them to the human beings. And this definitely gives us, as a species, gives us some advantage, but it's not enough. Because even with the crafts and with the fire, our life is horrifying and miserable, because there is no social harmony, there is no concord, no solidarity, no justice. So in this mythological story, human beings seem to live in a situation, broadly speaking, resembling the Hobbesian war of all against all. So what happens is that Zeus then gives human beings justice. And now this is what finally allows human beings to thrive. But I think Protagoras is inviting us to take this idea of Zeus's justice with a grain of salt. On the one hand, it seems, according to Protagoras, that justice is shared by all. That the same way that more or less every Greek person knows the Greek language, and therefore could be considered an expert or a teacher of Greek. In a similar fashion, says Protagoras, everybody living in a community should be aware of the laws of justice. And Protagoras even says that it would be considered madness to publicly and freely acknowledge one's own injustice. But at the same time, Protagoras seems to imply that justice is not exactly natural or innate, that it takes long years of habituation, training, or even, if you want, indoctrination, that ever since children are born, they are spanked, beaten, or threatened into submission, that they are forced to memorize by heart, so to speak, the rules of good conduct. And even when we are adults, the threat of punishment for transgressing the law is always close at hand. I think Protagoras even uses the metaphor of upbringing as the straightening of crooked wood. I think the implication is quite clear. By nature, we are crooked. By nature, we would not respect the laws of justice. It's only because society, against our nature, violently, so to speak, straightens us out, that human beings can actually live in societies together. And incidentally, it seems that religion plays a very important part in this process. In a well-known fragment from a different work, Protagoras famously proclaims that about the gods he does not know whether they exist or not, and in what shape. That is, what is their nature, or even maybe what is their law. I guess one of the first statements of agnosticism in the Western philosophical tradition. And the implication seems to be that Protagoras could very well be arguing, on broadly speaking empiricist grounds, that since we have no reliable, no clear public experience of the divine, no objective consensus is possible in matters of theology. But, and I think this is a crucially important point, it does not matter whether the philosophers can actually prove the existence of gods or not. Human cultures, the laws and customs of human societies, require religion for their smooth operation. So in a sense, it does not matter whether theologically we can prove the existence of gods. Politically, we have to assert the existence of the gods. And again, this is an idea which can be very prominently seen in the later tradition. I think we can very well see similar lines of reasoning in Plato. And in fact, in a couple of lectures, I will be arguing for a sophistic interpretation of Plato. Does Plato really know that the forms actually exist? Or is it a likely story that helps stabilize the social life of the polis? And then, of course, in the later tradition, thinkers such as Machiavelli, or Hobbes, or Locke, or Rousseau, and I suppose, of course, Hegel, who will talk about the absolute necessity of civic religion. And quite likely, it is actually Immanuel Kant who gives us one of the definitive formulations of this problem. So to briefly summarize Kant's position, it is impossible, absolutely impossible, for the human intellect to seriously talk about the things as they really are. And therefore, it is impossible for a human being to prove or actually disprove the existence of God. Maybe even much more than that. Maybe it's not even possible for a human being to truly understand the meaning of the word God. However, regardless of all that, within our morality, in order for our morality to work and to make sense, we have to postulate the existence of God, even though we may not be able to fully understand the meaning of this word, as well as several other things, such as immortality of the soul, as well as the divine judgment in the afterlife, rewards for the righteous, and punishment for the wicked. So, to go back to Protagoras, I think that so far we have been painting a rather bleak story, where ever since the time of our birth, we are subordinated, maybe even enslaved to our society, which threatens us with physical punishment, and also indoctrinates us into a system of religious ideology. Sounds very pessimistic. But there is an important flip side. Protagoras is seemingly anticipating Aristotle's later dictum that man is by nature a political animal. And I think essentially what this dictum comes down to is that for us, it is only possible to be properly human and to be truly happy or fulfilled only within a well-functioning community. So it is quite plausible that we have something like the bare bones of a social contract theory embedded in Protagoras' philosophy. That yes, indeed, there's all this pressure and indoctrination, and maybe even the demand of sacrifices issuing from our societies. However, at the end of the day, the life within the city is so much better than the life without the city. Beginning from the fact that children simply don't survive unless they're taken care of by their parents. But also I think in this proto-Hobbesian fashion, if we imagine this condition of men before Zeus gave them justice, basically this condition of war of all against all, truly horrifying. So it seems that Protagoras is suggesting that ultimately it is in our interest to uphold the rules of justice, even though our nature may mistakenly incline us to do otherwise. And yet, all of these discussions sound so extremely subversive. Is it appropriate to raise such questions? Is it really appropriate to debate the advantages or disadvantages of justice? Could it be that it is best to be silent about these matters and to just let the culture take its course? Well, let me make a couple of suggestions. So first of all, in the next lectures, we will meet other sophists, like Thrasymachus or Callicles or Antiphon, who seem to be much more pessimistic about the concept of justice. Thrasymachus, for example, would say that justice is nothing else but simply the interest of the stronger. And in fact, we should try to subvert the laws of justice as far as we can. It seems that even the earliest versions of the social contract were vulnerable, so to speak, to the free rider problem. So William Guthrie, in the seminal work on Greek philosophy, talks about how it seems that in earlier times, in smaller communities, justice has something of a natural character. When the community is small, the interests of the individuals seem to be very closely allied with the interests of the whole. I would imagine that the paradigmatic example of this is the family. Again, reminded of this proverb, the best place to store your food is in your neighbor's stomach. Again, in a small community, it is very much in my interest not to cheat my neighbor, because very likely, tomorrow I will have to call upon my neighbor to defend me from other tribes, or wild animals, or something along those lines. But when societies become larger and more impersonal, it becomes possible to reap the advantages of justice in a sense of sort of everybody else being just, without being just oneself, especially if one can break the law in secret, living in a just community with a reputation for justice, but secretly being unjust. Isn't that the best deal? I think it is a philosophical possibility that we should very much take seriously. And if indeed we come to the conclusion that something like this conflictual account is indeed true, shouldn't we look this problem in the eye and try to find the best response? And what would the response look like? It seems that with Protagoras' rudimentary form of the social contract theory, that the best way to go about solving this problem, the free rider problem, is exactly through the public discussion and public deliberation. If our laws and customs allow for the free rider problem, maybe we should change our laws and customs. And what is the measure of the proper laws and customs? We know from Protagoras, man is the measure of all things. Again, I think very importantly, we see in sophists in general, and in Protagoras in particular, if not a revolutionary, then at least a reformist, a progressive attitude to politics. Jerry Cohen, an important contemporary Marxist thinker, identifies an important democratic element in the sophistic teaching, seemingly opposed to the poetic, but also to the Platonic and the Aristotelian defense of aristocracy. It is the sophists and Protagoras who, by demystifying politics, by contrasting physis, the law of nature, with nomos, the laws of society, by drawing our attention to the factual relativism, to the difference in the laws and customs of the various communities. So, again, by stripping away the sacred status of laws, they open the door to asking the important question of what is the purpose of the laws. And it seems that the only possible answer could be that the purpose of the laws is our human well-being. And therefore, something like the social contract theory has to follow. And therefore, at least prima facie, it seems that democracy is the proper way to govern society. Or even if not democracy, then some other popularly sanctioned regime. So let's say, even if the power is in the hands of the aristocrats, they govern based on the consent of the people at large, that it is indeed best that they should govern. And I think ultimately, even if we are not necessarily satisfied with the kinds of answers that Protagoras gives, I think undoubtedly his questions point in the right direction. And on this note, I leave you to your reflection, and we shall continue our discussion of the sophistic tradition next time. And until then, take care.